Yeah.
Anyways, I wanted to ask you this. What was it that happened? It's not very clear what this was, whether it was a conflict or disagreement that happened between the Zeitgeist movement and the Venus Project. Because I remember watching that, what's his name? Jacques Fresco, that he said you guys had a disagreement, but he didn't say much else about that. Was it, so can you tell us what happened?
I've always been hesitant to expand on that any more than necessary because it's petty. It was a kind of, after 2 years of working with the Venus Project and allocating tremendous resources and such to the Venus Project, they felt fearful of their identity, and they felt like I personally, who was their biggest advocate, who had brought them out and was their biggest fan, obviously, and they felt like I was interfering with some kind of identity that they had. And in one level, my final insult was that I was trying to, usurp Jock, something like that, as an ego trip. And I couldn't tolerate that. So on a personal level, and I never, asked anybody to stop interaction with them. In fact, we still have partnership stuff that we do. The linguistic team still works with the Venus Project, and so on and so forth. So, and I just stopped talking about it because, okay, I don't want to do any more damage to any of this. Venus Project has a think tank type of structure. They're not a movement, and that's great. That's Jock's work. That's Jock's life's work. And that should exist as it is. The movement is a linear force trying to do everything possible with every bridge possible, with any options we can find to make things happen for the better. I mean, obviously our goal, the resource-based economic model, and what defines that train of thought, it's shared to a degree, but I could actually say there are some differences the way I personally think and communicate and the way Jock thought and communicated when it comes to nuances of things. But I don't want to go into that either because it seems like people become competitive when you start talking like that, and I hate that. So I just say, everything keeps changing and moving, and I hope another organization comes along that's even better than the Zeitgeist movement, because there's always going to be a time span for things. It's been 10 years of this, and I'm not going to be mad if someone took all these ideas and made it better. I would never be mad at that. I could sleep finally.
Yeah.
Hi there. In your presentation, you talked about or at least the Mr. Beer. He was talking about the fifth system, and the gentleman he was talking to was about people, right?
Yeah.
So just the idea of the recurring system or recursive system and systems working within systems, in what role will people have with working in conjunction with that system?
That's a great point, and you can read a whole book on it. What I'd like to do now is actually put it in the context of what's going on right now in the 21st century, because that was a long time ago, the way they were approaching. But basically decentralization, something that is on everyone's tongue now that's thinking forward. Decentralization, where you have pockets of people that are mostly independent, remember the autonomy property that I talked about, and they are connected to other pockets of people. They're autonomous to a certain degree. They manage their own work. I'll give you an example. Think about an energy grid. Instead of the consolidated energy grid that we have now, with you have a decentralized energy grid where people are actually producing their own energy independently on their own structures that they own, their homes, solar panels, and so on. So they are, in a sense, their own singular system, semi-autonomous. They're still vulnerable to the environment, and they're still connected to others, because what do you do in that circumstance? You connect that viable system of that home producing that renewable energy. Anything that they do in excess of their use goes back into a larger grid with all the other homes doing exactly the same thing. Suddenly you don't have a centralized energy authority. This has been talked about by a lot of people. It's not my idea. I mean, Jeremy Rifkin's talked about this, the internet of the energy internet, he calls it. And it's very logical. Eventually, that's the way it's going to be. So that's a great example of it. Did that answer your question? You mentioned the top tier fifth thing. Well, think about the democratic sense of you deciding to have your own energy, off the grid, so to speak, energy world for your own work in your own home. But you're also participating in the larger collective. So think about mesh networks with cell phones and the internet. I love thinking about this. So your phone can actually be changed into be a signal itself. And if everyone has a phone with the same signal going to each other's phones as a big network, you could create a cell phone network without any controlled authority. You could create an internet structure without any controlled authority. No one can flick a switch. No one can control it. No one can censor things. there are caveats. There's lots of things that you could talk about technically, you know. But that's the kind of thinking. So if you bridge all that out, what you have are economic agents that are autonomous, but yet, as pointed out in the model, they exist in an environment where they're trying to, you know, bridge things together to respect that system unity. And they're autonomous at the same time, and they regulate their own little world while it works in that hierarchical levels of recursion, they call it. I'll leave it at that for now, because I can go on a spiral of things. But the idea of autonomous, collective autonomy, so to speak, where everyone's an individual agent, just like your body, your liver, and so as your liver respects the fact that it's a part of your body, and it has its own self-regulatory mechanisms along with the regulatory mechanisms of your body. And the only thing I would add to that is that when you have, say, your own home with that energy grid, you're going to have self-regulating mechanisms in that grid simultaneously that you monitor. So you're in control of that element of the whole node system.
Okay, so this question is kind of twofold, and if possible, actually, and I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name in the purple down there.
Josephine.
Josephine, would this might actually be best answered by you, but I'll ask first. About critical mass, I wanted to ask about critical mass and how we bring about more wide sweeping changes, because obviously, you know, we've got a very politically inert class who's not interested. They're not going to implement changes legislatively. So, you know, strategies for sort of motivating that. And the part I wanted to ask you, Josephine, was you were at talking about the basic income conference and how this is actually happening. My big concern is that if the Conservatives get elected, that they'll cancel the pilot program and that it won't go forward. So do we have any kind of feedback on that?
First of all, I think they felt a little frightened to say that they wouldn't continue it. So at the moment they claim that they would. I don't trust that guy, obviously. I think, you know, our first move is if that guy looks like he's winning or he's going to win, we make sure the Liberals and NDP form a coalition, because then we have critical mass to ensure he doesn't get in power. That's one thing. But I will say the basic income is absolutely vital as a means by which people can be freed up to make these changes and change their behavior. Because, for instance, I would love to go and hang out at the Repair Cafe. It's very rare that I can actually squeeze out the time and the money to go and get there, which is really sad, right? And my project work is the same problem. But when it comes to critical mass to make massive change, you have a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that climate chaos is throwing a level of urgency that has never existed before, and it's real, and we can't, you know, well, people can pretend it's not there, but we all know it is, right? Secondly, the dinosaurs who thought there was no future, who grew up thinking that they had to get under the desk and that the world was going to blow up any second, they're aging out. So you need to take hold of the people who are coming into positions of systems power and structural power, and you need to meet with them and talk to them. You need to remember that you pay them to make change. You pay them to change our systems. They are using our money, right? And they're also being paid by us. So that's imperative. And I would lastly say that if you want to get a sense of how that human part of a system, a structural system, can operate in a self-corrective way, this is where human rights education comes into play. If you actually look at the treaties this country signed in our name and then, you know, neglected to tell anybody about it, if you actually look how they work based on the kind of model that Peter's talking about, because it starts off with the notion of self-determination, but responsibility, right. Collective self-determination and responsibility. Institutions, individuals, state, all have the rights and the responsibilities. So now you see that you're having a complex system with a framework of guidelines that you can apply, and of course there's going to be issues and times when they bump up against each other, but we have to stop sitting around and saying, oh, well, let's wait for somebody to bring this into being. No, we already have these systems, we have these blueprints, and we can utilize them. We utilize them in our community organizing, in a very diverse community with people from all over the world, because they get it. It's much easier than talking about poverty or ecological disaster. We talk about human rights, and then we ground it in ecological needs and realities. And in that way, we connect the dots between the ecology, human rights, structural change, systems change, and the ability to finally hit that critical mass point.
Damn. Yeah, stay with us. You could do my speaking for me.
Actually, well, Lawrence, while you're going to find somebody for the mic, I have a question about your presentation.
Okay,
Is that right?
please.
Sure. So, this was very theoretical, and so I work with Emily, I work with Lawrence with the Toronto Tool Library, and we're part of the Institute for a Resource-Based Economy. And in this presentation, I don't think we heard a resource-based economy once. So I'm interested, has your perspective changed, or should we be renaming our organization?
Well, remember, as I said at the very beginning, I've done so many talks and focused on so much about the resource-based economic model, or natural all resource-based economic model, whatever you want to call it. And this was a variant of my presentation style. You know, usually I'm all encompassing. So no, I choose to go for the train of thought in description, though. When you start to label things, again, you have that categorical thought problem, and you end up with symbols. And I'd rather avoid the symbols and names and titles and just go straight to the jugular of the train of thought, because that's where the argument is. So does that make sense? I have never changed my view on any of it. There are subtleties, I think, that I've educated myself about in terms, you know, this particular kind of thinking systemically is a little bit different, I think, for example, than the general model of the resource-based economy proposed by the Venus Project. There's actually far more centralization in their original proposal than the decentralized reality that we've become to see so much more robust over the past 10 years. So things are morphing and changing, and as they should, you know, and things will change even more. I mean, we don't know what's around the corner in terms of what that core integral solution will be that will really alter our framework of what's actually going to work and what isn't.
First of all, thanks for the presentation. Thanks for coming, Peter.
I have no idea where you are.
I'm over here.
Oh, yeah. It was God.
I actually have a three-part question and also a word of caution as well. The three-part question, as an activist, the barriers I hit up against most often are, well, that RBE idea sounds terribly useful, and I think that would suit me down to the ground, but how do we get there? Yeah. I get that probably every 24 hours. The second part is, how do you find hope in all of this? Because human evolution is so deathly slow that it's very difficult to actually spot it happening. And I share, and there's only so many times I can share Toronto Tool Library postings and, you know, segment videos of the Zeitgeist series. And what else can I do? What else can be done? And then the word of caution is actually about universal basic income. I've studied this as well personally, and what I can't get to grips with is that if you understand the very basic laws of supply and demand in economics, then you must also understand that if we give everyone, say, I don't know, $1,000 a month, then all the corporations will cotton on to this fact and say, okay, well, a cup of Starbucks is now $15 instead of $5, and a transatlantic flight is now $8,000 instead of $800. And, you know, the cost of rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Toronto will go from $1,000 a month average to $10,000 a month. That's just basic inflation. So given that that's what we already know, how on earth can something like UBI work? And is it not just, you know, the last ditch attempt by rich people to try and keep money relevant to humankind? Okay,
we'll go backwards. First, I agree with the caveat that there is a dire multi-tiered, I'll put it this way, the general system has so many different externalities that are negative that simply giving people a basic income doesn't solve so many other things that are being problematically caused by capitalism. So there's other things that have to be done, right, obviously. In the 1970s, there was a big credit expansion, and it's because that the economy was so bad, they decided to just give everybody credit and have credit cards, a culture of credit cards, where people are spending back into the system from loans, and that was what was driving economic growth at that time. And that's precisely what UBI could be used for, so to speak, where they're going to give more money into a society that's dysfunctional, that has great inequity, great imbalance, great, 63% of Americans don't have $1,000 in savings. So when you resolve that little bit, you're actually removing a certain degree of angst. You're creating a little bit of placation. That's a side of it, though. So see my point? So you placate people by giving them money, therefore they don't question the system anymore, right? And we have to question the system because there's plenty of other things that are going wrong with the system. There's no one fix for this. But at the same time, if you give people money, and you educate them, I mean, that's pivotal. And they can learn and have time and to think and time to look at all the other problems. They can have sustenance, don't have to to not have to worry about their job and their family every day like most do, not have the stress of that. And that much time alleviation, I think, is what will allow for the education to flourish and for all the other problems to be discussed. And inevitably, those people will not be placated. They will actually move and be motivated to change even more than they could when they were so structurally oppressed by poverty. Does that make sense? So that's one side of it. I want to let you touch upon that if you'd like to. Would you like to touch upon that? Let me go. Okay, so the second question was hope. Well, and I think that combines with your first question, which had to do with, well, how do we get there, right? It's a part of that process. As I said in the conference 2 days ago, to have hope is really a heroic act. To be positive is a heroic act, because your hope is a feeling. I'd say it's synonymous with being confident that something can be changed, right? We can play semantic games, but that's the way I interpret it. And it's a heroic act to actually stand up and say, yeah, I'm confident we can do this, even if you're standing in the face in Tiananmen Square of a guy standing in front of a tank. And that's the analogy I use. Well, did he have hope? Was he confident? But it didn't matter, because he did what needed to be done. And that is a shared value. If we respect ourselves in society, it doesn't matter how many brick walls are built around us. You have to keep that positive focus. There's no way around it, because there's too much at risk. Otherwise, you might as well just slit your throat right then, because the value of yourself is really so diminished that you're so apathetic and you don't care, basically. So you have to strive forward. And as far as I'm concerned, humans are humans. We're all humans. We're thinking. We're doing things. We change humans' thoughts. We can change society. That's how it happens. The question is, how do we do it? And that goes to your first question. Well, there is a movement. There's multiple movements. It's an educational kind of process at this point. But what I'd like to see happen, on the heels of all this, is actually a developmental project where a lot of the larger order structural changes that I've spoken of over the years, not just the cybernetic stuff, even though I think that's integral, it needs to be put into practice in research, like through a university system, a university project, excuse me. Imagine all the universities in the world taking on sustainable management and economic sustainability management in this kind of thinking, and they all started to work together to create the actual systems. Because when you look at this on paper, eventually this resource-based economy will be a series of symbolic algorithmic forms. That's the way it's going to come out through computer language and the language of math and science, because that's what's going to be behind it. That's what's going to be under the hood. And that has to be programmed, because you're going to have an autonomous system with all the properties of nature, synergistically, recursive, all those things feed into it. It has to be designed. So we talk all day about it, but someone has to step up. And again, I've asked people to do this. I did a lecture, Natural Law Economic Calculation in a Natural Law Resource-Based Economy in 2013 in Berlin. And I outlined this very large symbolic algorithm. It was general, but I think it served its role. It's also in the 2 books that I wrote. And that's really what I'm focusing on now. And if I had time to break away from all the other communicative things I'm doing, I would try to get people together to start this programming project, and ideally get it picked up by universities and get grants for it. And if you set that in motion, it'd be over. Because you would actually have something provably testable. The scientific method would be put in place. You could test it in small pockets. Eventually, it'd be applied to a city somewhere and how they manage their own local area. Because I will say, what I believe will happen because of more with less and ephemeralization, eventually technology is going to become so small. Are you familiar with the term ephemeralization or more with less? So technology and processes are going to become so small and so effective, such low amounts of energy and resource use to produce more and more and more, that's not unheard of that you're going to have a society with effectively a small 3D printing style, very diverse, versatile system of production that can produce everything, say, Toronto ever needed, along with, say, vertical farm systems that do the same thing in terms of food. So everything becomes localized because of the progress of technology. That will happen if we let it. And you shut down globalization as we know it economically, and you start to localize, use more with less, efficiency will go exponential. And suddenly, as an aside, in fact, I was reading the exploitation of Latin and South America. The reason they've been so destroyed is because they never were able to build their industries up enough to be independent. And if you look at the behavior of Western hegemony, that's what they do. They constantly destroy nations and hit them with sanctions to reduce their efficiency and independence. And that is an unfortunate side effect of this, and why on a political level, on a social oppression level, on a human rights level, you have to start getting off the grid as individual communities. Again, going back to her question, you're never completely off the grid. You're a part of everything else, but you want to create that independent, viable system for your community and region, and it builds up systemically, in that recursive sense from there. So that's one idea. So that's the kind of shit I think about all the time. And I think it can be done. It's too bad that we feel that staticness. Anyway, I'll keep rambling. Anybody else want to add some confidence for my friend over here?
Can I add one thing, and then you can take the basic thing up? So, like, just in relation to that concept of hope, and how to foster that in people and get people thinking about the changes that need to happen and how to do it. So the folks that started the Toronto Tool Library and Sharing Depot, we all used to live communally in a house together, my daughter included. And it was a really beautiful experience, like talk about, you know, a world-changing way of living. But I went out one day and got groceries, and I think I refused a plastic bag because I carry a zero waste kit as an act of defiance against plastic. And it starts a lot of conversations. People are always asking, like, oh my God, what's this bread bag? Why are you putting bread in this cotton bag? And the particular person that I got that day was angry about my refusal of the plastic bag, and she was like, "You'll never change anything. This is impossible. You know, it's everywhere. It's nothing we can do." And I went home kind of like bummed out, and I went into the kitchen. I swear to God, one day I'm going to write a book called In the Kitchen. But the conversations that we had in that kitchen were like fantastic. And I started talking to Lawrence, and I was like, "Man, like." Why are people so negative? I can't understand it. And he brought up the point that, you know, like we kind of live in a bubble because we are so engaged in the changes that are happening. And I think that when people start getting involved in community projects, whether it's a group that's, you know, promoting universal basic income, or whether it's somebody who's developing, you know, these big picture technologies like blockchain, the Toronto Tool Library and Sharing Depot, you know, that's all run by volunteers. The volunteers come into the space and run that thing. The more you're involved in those things, the more hope is infectious. So social media is extremely important. Like you talked about the photo of the guy standing in front of the tank, that gets shared over and over and over again. Like it's amplified like crazy, and that in itself is a form of inspiring hope. But I think the change really comes when you get out and you start acting in your community, because people really, that hope is infectious. So that's all I would add to that.
Yeah, of course, you know, in the current status quo, any tool can be misused, any idea can be co-opted, and that's something that we're all aware of. So what's one of the reasons why I'm advocating very much to ensure that basic income is brought in the context of human rights, so that government then takes on its responsibility to ensure rent control, to ensure that, you know, the other parts of the economy don't leap on that and try to suck it dry, which, you know, some will. But the great thing is, you know, rather than, I shouldn't say that. I have maybe once or twice in my life stepped into a Walmart. We can starve the beast, right? We have so much material surplus, and now we have things like the tool library, and like, we just starve the beast. So if they want to charge $8,000 to fly across the ocean, we'll live stream, or we'll take a boat. You know what I'm saying? Like, we feel so helpless, we have to stop being helpless. We are not helpless. I've been at this for over 30 years. I have grandchildren, and it's a struggle to be hopeful. I don't even really think about hope too much. I think about determination. I think about, you know, warriorship, in a sense, about how I can take my rage of watching your generation and my kids' generation be robbed of everything that we were thinking we were going to have in our future. I take that rage and I channel it into determination. So hope or not hope isn't really relevant to me. It's, I'm alive, I'm a human, I have children, I have to do this. That's all there is to it. And I make sure I have as good a time as humanly possible doing it, so as an antidote to knowing far too much and having seen far too much, and actually met some of those people, like face to face, the people who destroyed our nation. I have to live with that. But I'm a human rights defender, so, you know, it gives me a sense of strength, it gives me a sense of being grounded, and we all can and must do everything we can in our power, whether it's a small thing or a big thing, and it's when we are doing things about it, then you have something stronger than hope. You have purpose, and you have the knowledge that you're doing what needs to be done, and that's a far greater strength and motivation than any hope could ever be, in my opinion.
And there was one thing I just remembered about the gentleman's question. He talked about inflation. Now, that all is contingent upon where the money comes from. Does it come from redistribution from the crazy billionaire class? Does it come from government mass misallocations and surpluses that they have behind the scenes? In this conference, I saw so many different sources of this UBI. It was really quite amazing. And there is, while inflation, if you inject money into a system, the basic money theory of inflation applies. The more money in the system, the more it reduces the value of the money individually per unit. But that's a pretty complicated process in general. If the money is being put to use, it actually doesn't happen like that. And I think legislation, if need be, could put forward to avoid the abuse of any kind of corporation that wants to stick it to the consumer. And keep in mind also that there's a competitive quality too. So unless there's a mass kind of monopolistic cartel where all the coffee shops get together to, go $8 a cup and force everybody to pay for it, they're not going to do that. They're going to want to keep it as close as they can to be competitive and keep, the money, to keep the price as low as possible. So it's not that simple. In other words, it's not an equation of a bunch more money, inflation. It just isn't that clear.
Hey, Peter. As a youngling who first became excited and empowered with the Zeitgeist movement when it first began, I paid close attention to the movement, part of which involved watching your interviews, some of your interviews and debates with certain figures. A memorable one was your one with Mark Dice, and your other one with Stefan Molyneux, who are both more or less market advocates or libertarian types. There are people who are prone to calling you a socialist or a Marxist, right? So to be brief, in your third film, you and in a few debates that you've been in, you tended to denounce democracy as a means to reaching this your vision. Has your position on democracy changed at all?
Would you mind clarifying what you mean by that? Because I've never denounced the idea of public participation in control of their society and environment. Now, democracy can take on different meanings.
Yep.
I don't denounce democracy in the basic Greek concept of it. What I denounce is the pop culture version of democracy that we have instituted on the planet today. So it's specific to that. I clearly believe that humans need to have, in this autonomous kind of logic as promoted, control and contribution to the world that's around them. It has to be that way, otherwise people get alienated. Even if their ideas are wrong, there is a reason for them to contribute, and the process, if it's working and has a proper referent, will weed out the correct over the, will weed out the right, weed out the wrong, excuse me, over the right. So, if you have an economic democracy, for example, where, I'll take it to that level. So you have an economic democracy in the future where people are going online and they're accessing shared open source systems that design goods. So no more corporations. What you have is a structure like this. People go on these systems, they have a background in certain kinds of engineering and education, if they choose to, by the way. Not every human being needs to do this, but this is how it would work for those that chose to contribute, who are educated enough to program the language that can design goods, CAD, 3D engineering, and stuff like that. So they go on, they produce this. They do it in a democratic open source way because they are engaging all these other designers to try and figure out how to make the best possible good for that point in time. Now, is that the only thing that is in play? No. You have that other level, the environment of the system, where you have to account for the resources. So if you have resource scarcity on the planet, that's clear. You don't just start building things that clearly are going to overshoot those resources. So there's self-limits that are imposed by nature. And if you program that in properly, you're going to have a tight system where people respect the fact that they're always working within the confines of what is sustainable, and they're always going to work within the confines of efficiency simultaneously, because with the birth of AI, you actually have systems now that can look at a design that an engineer puts forward and analyze it for its integrity. They can actually understand if what they've put forward matches the math that has been programmed into it. Caveats, of course, you have to rely on the algorithmic programming, the integrity of all that, but we have a world run by algorithms already, and it works pretty well on a basic technical level. I'm confident it would work that way in the future too. Point being, you have democratic participation within the environment of rules that are immutable and variant and dynamic, and that's why the system constantly updates and tells you and gives you new information. Oh, we're running out of this material in Africa, we're going to have to substitute something else. So then boom, the engineering team gets on, the engineers know what they need to do. If they want to have this particular utility in a good, they have to find a substitute, and automatic economic balance and homeostasis starts to be created based effectively around the laws of nature.
So this is a question for the master storyteller, and then as a follow-up to Peter Joseph as well afterwards. You showed us a clip from a movie that inspired you. You mentioned how watching the Zeitgeist films woke you up to another reality. And I've watched all 3 films. I remember I think it was the last film, at the end, there was this difference between gluttony and people just throwing things away and being wasteful, and then an alternative to it. And it was just touching on a storytelling aspect that was interesting. I've also read your new book, The New Human Rights Movement, and it's incredible. And there's all these leading edge concepts in them that are real in the world today and need to be grounded out and developed. What I think needs to happen now is some serious and effective storytelling. The kind of stuff that blows people's minds, sends them to the theaters in the millions, makes hundreds of millions of dollars. And I'd just like you to touch on these amazing ideas and how they can be spun and pushed into the mainstream to excite people. And then following that, what Peter would say to that as well.
Yeah, so I would say, like, in terms of the movement, like, I would like to see the global chapters, social media, become like have a unified strategy where that storytelling element is at the center. Because I can tell you from my experience with working with environmental organizations in social media, including the Tool Library, the stuff that really takes off is the solutions. People are not interested in being told that the system is shitty. Just like in the film where the girl is like sitting there with her hand up, it's like, what can we do? Like, we get it. People are not interested in that. They want the solutions. So the stuff that gets shared off of our page is the zero waste soap and the bags that get made out of reusable fabric, and the powerful impact of borrowing and the community aspect of it. We ran a crowdfund recently because we didn't get a grant and we needed funding for the organization, and it took no time at all. The thing just went nuts. It was surprising, like, it was shocking. The community that is rallying around this idea loves that solution-oriented stuff. So I would say, in terms of like fleshing out the story of the Zeitgeist movement and where those solutions are hiding, you just start storytelling in a way that is cohesive and comprehensive and consistent. So that would be my answer to that.
Into Reflections, the film I can't seem to make. This entire idea of the film trilogy that I'm doing is all live action. It's all psychological. It's a multi-genre piece that attempts to psychologically invoke certain emotions related to the concepts put forward by the movement and the train of thought. And effectively, it's going to work in multiple time frames and multiple levels. It's partly documentary. It's partly extremely I'd say there's a horror element to it. There's a quality to it where it examines society as we see it today, but I put it in a horror movie context, in part, not that direct. But the 3 films are going to create an arc, and it shows the movement of society to a new social system. I don't want to give it away as far as how I do it, so I'm not going to give you much detail. But because it's multi-genre, I'm going at every angle of aesthetic that comes out in film. So there's a comedic element, there's a musical element, there's a satire element, there's a thriller element, there's again the horror element. And then there's the documentary element that kind of underscores the whole thing. It's a sci-fi movie that's based upon cliches that have existed throughout society. It takes all the memes that we've been hearing today, from even from the school shootings to Occupy Wall Street to even the more solution-oriented things like decentralization to blockchain and Bitcoin. All of this kind of stuff, I'm putting this amalgamation to kind of when people walk out of this thing, people are gonna feel hopefully kind of inspired and overwhelmed, but also the fundamental point of the film is vagary. What I firmly believe is that you hit people over the head with a book like I wrote. Okay, yeah, I'm glad you appreciated that. Most people get through about a quarter of it, and their attention span can't handle any more of it. And that's a problem of society and the media as we know, and social media, unfortunately, it does a little bit of that to people too. Twitter culture can't think anymore. It's like just little fragments of thoughts. I think that has an effect on a lot of people, not everybody. I'm not putting down social media. But anyway, so the vagary element, I explicitly create scenes and things that will get under people's skin through symbology without ever really telling them what it means. And that, I think, is one of the most important things about creative development is you want people to walk away with it by making their own story of what they just saw. And that makes it their own, sneaks behind their ego, and suddenly when they realize something, they realized it. They're the ones that came up with it, not somebody imposing their ideas upon them. And I think that's a powerful level of creative development. That's why music is so great, because music is generally ambiguous, but it has kernels of direct communication, but the gesture and everything that's underneath it, everyone pulls a little bit something different out of it. That's why songs have this life. Like, no one watches a movie 400 times. People will listen to a song 400 times. So I'm a musician at heart, so that's kind of where my source is. Anyway, did you want to add anything? Okay.
I have two questions. I got a question for Brother Peter, and I have a question for everybody in the room. My first question is, right now, as far as I know, the renowned scientists in the world are working on the quantum computer. And I noticed in your video, you were showing the moment of when one of the first computers were being developed, and you were talking about how important that it was for the evolution of humanity. Well, I don't know if people understand anything about the quantum computer, but right now the computers that we use operate on the speed of light. And they can only they can only do one equation at a time. Right. With the quantum computer, it could do multiple equations at a time. So it's going to change our reality and our world exponentially. So I would have a question. My question is, do you have anything that you know, or any vision, or any sort of relativity that you would have to see how that is going to impact humanity?
I think you kind of implied it's going to change everything in terms of speed. Because what did the computer do? Is they enabled people to actually have time to do other things while the computer crunched numbers. And then you get outputs, and then you build upon that. I mean, everyone's familiar with the exponential increase in technology, you know, like the Moore's Law chip, you know, the biggest computer, and now the chip in your phone is, you know, it's obviously much smaller and uses found incredibly less power, less resources, and yet is 1,000 times more powerful. And that's probably what quantum computing will do to the current digital state. I agree with that. So the exponential curve, it's an information technology. In other words, information is behind all computing. It's information, it's code. If you can convert any problem in society to information technology, and you can input that into a computer, and then you put it into a quantum computer, you have huge, massive increases in intellectual development and scientific inquiry. So that's mind-blowing where we could end up when it comes to really efficiently using the advancements that are coming in all areas. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
every area. And it still amazes me, like because everyone's like, oh, exponential stuff only applies to computers right now. And of course, people will argue, they say, well, it's going to stop because the chip, you know, can't get any smaller, right? But then quantum computing comes along and says, nope, we're going to go far deeper now. And then you just take all the disciplines, anything you create, any idea, and you put it into that language. It's going to be unbelievable. Human life extension, you know, all sorts of things are going to be resolved if we get past this hurdle that we're currently in. Also, at the same time, though, look at what we're doing. It's the war machine, man, and you know, all technology gets the war machine first. And we should all be really terrified about what the Pentagons of the world are doing with their quantum developments and what that's going to end up doing. So there's always that double-edged sword. That's the whole Buckminster Fuller livingry versus weaponry contrast. Because do we use this amazing stuff for good and development and livingry, or is it just going to go straight to the war machine and destruction and weaponry? So,
well said, and then that goes into how we need to program technology for the future, so it doesn't do just that. Now, my second question is for everybody in the room. Toronto is an Anishinaabe word. It means meeting place. Toronto is a special city. I just learned last night from overhearing conversations, because I have ears like a satellite, that Toronto is going to be designated to be a test site for a smart city.
All right.
So everything I see you present in your presentation is relevant to us. As it being the meeting place, this is the most diverse city in the world. So everyone is coming to this city and gathering around the world. All of our ideas, all of our cultures, and all of our energies are merging. So this is a very pivotal place. It is becoming the epicenter of the world. So my question for everybody in the room is, given the presentation and given the knowledge that we all collectively share in this room, what are we going to do about it? what are we going to do to preserve Toronto as that place? What are we going to do?
That's always the most important question, is what are you going to do about it? I'd like to add to that story. There was a prophecy in this place, in this meeting place, about 500 years ago. And a indigenous woman prophesied that the peoples of the world would come together and begin to heal the planet from Turtle Island. And she made that prophecy here in the meeting place because the peoples of this region used to come here to dialogue and figure out what they were going to do as they were doing their original democracy, which we borrowed and screwed up. So there is a prophecy that this is going to happen. So the fact that we are the most diverse place in the world, and we are here now when this has to happen. You asked about hope earlier, and I shouldn't have said hope is kind of irrelevant. That's not really fair. I should say that with blockchain technology, with things like the Zeitgeist movement, in the last few years, the rapid change of consciousness and the rapid awakening of peoples and the speed at which that's occurring is giving me a great deal of strength and motivation and encouragement. So I want to say that, you know, we can take ideas like the quantum computer, like blockchain, like the basic income, and we have to remember that we are the people who have to make it be what we want it to be. And we are in a great position to do that. And we may also end up in 50 or 70 years being one of the last places on Earth where people can actually survive and thrive. So let us not forget that as we're thinking about being a smart city, is we got to feed what's left of the world in 50 years as our climate goes upside down, right? So there's a lot we have to do, but we can do it. The thing that's really hopeful and beautiful is that we are rising to the challenge, and it's happening. And all of you have been a part of that process. So keep that up, keep moving, and don't, one of the ways to starve the beast is don't waste your time thinking and talking about fucking Trump, okay? Spend your time thinking about how we're going to not do that, how we're going to be way better, right? And how we're just going to make shit happen different. Don't get stuck in the boxes. Don't get stuck in the assumptions. Don't get stuck in the bullshit model of monetary whatever. It never made sense, and it really doesn't anymore. And we know it. So it's those of us who put out these systems and ideas and concepts for people to grasp and to go in and feel and touch that are going to make that shift happen in such speed it'll blow your mind, and I'm sure of it. And I'm old enough to say, like many of my generation do, oh, it's all hopeless, it's too late, it is what it is. No, bullshit. Y'all are going to change it quick, and I know it, so don't worry.
Thanks. I think we'll take a couple more, and then, yeah, there's a lot of humans who want to ask questions.
So I guess this is to the whole panel. I'm here. It's wonderful to talk about the advancement of technology and the advancement of intellectualism and all of these concepts that are very heady, but the whole talk tonight, I haven't heard too much about heart and about the expansion of love and the expansion of caring, which I think has to go hand in hand with our intellectualism and our technology. Otherwise, we're too far on the left side and not enough on the right side. And I know that the tool library, and that is about creation, which is right side, right brain thinking and all that kind of stuff, but I think that we haven't really talked about expanding our heart centers so that we're thinking about everybody as ourselves.
You probably can't see me, but thank you for that question. I think heart and compassion at a fundamental level is about including other people in your life. So it's empathy, but it's also inclusiveness at the same time. And I think we can relate it back to the previous question about how do you continue to treat Toronto as a meeting place as people develop it as a smart city. It's the same idea. How do you treat it as a meeting place? How do you have heart in a city that becomes increasingly technological? I think that a smart city, what we mean when we say that is that we are deliberately solving problems, generally with technology. But technology comes in many forms. And we can think of technology as artificial intelligence and blockchain, which have a barrier to entry that isn't available to most of us. But technology the way that we order ourselves, the way that we organize ourselves and structure our organizations, that's also a form of technology. And so the tool library, that's our attempt to develop a very rudimentary technology of inclusiveness and heart, right? That's how you share yourself with other people, by creating, I don't know, a form of organization that includes people and that depends upon other people. And the more people you bring in, the more you have to share with each other. So that's, at a very basic level, what I think about and introducing heart to this. But maybe somebody else has something.
We'll go down the line. Cool. We'll all answer this one because it's a great open question. My view is what is the condition reinforcing? So if we want a world where people are cooperative and empathic and caring and loving, what facilitates that? Because everything has a precondition. And in our current system, sadly enough, the opposite is generally reinforced. So what I would say is that I think that the collaborative side of humanity, you know, we have sides. We do have a competitive side. We do have a collaborative side. I would argue the collaborative side is actually more efficient and more productive and also more natural to the human condition. But we are versatile species. And when we have to be competitive and harsh, well, we're going to survive, and that's what happens. And that's unfortunately what the system, that's its MO. That's what it does to people's psychology. So it's systemically reducing people's empathy and ability to love. And I think once the chains are broken, then our ability to actually be freely empathic and caring and respect strangers and not be fearful of each other, that will finally be allowed to flourish naturally.
Yeah, and to build on what he said, you know, there are folks working on a variety of ways of supporting and facilitating that. So that's one of the reasons why I'm a human rights defender and educator, because it is like the legal expression of love, if you like. It is, you know, takes the great principles of humankind and of philosophies and puts them into a structure that we can actually utilize. So when we're building organizations that are inclusive, etc., we also have to be able to be structured and organized around how we make that really effective. And there's a variety of tools that we have currently that we can utilize for that. For instance, building cooperatives. Cooperatives require self-determination, education, respect, all these things. They're like the organizational expression of human rights. Blockchain technology, which allows, you know, a continual disbursement of accountability and information and smart contracts, et cetera, so that you can see out in the open everything that took place and it can't be twisted or screwed up, is like the technological expression of a system that can allow for human rights to flourish, not through a mediated center, but person to person and indirect, as it can also to our mediums of exchange. And that's why we're also building a time bank. Because the thing about a time bank where people exchange time credits and services and the like is that a person's need actually creates wealth for the person that serves their need. So a person who is ill or tired or old or whatever and can't deliver a service to the time bank creates wealth for those who have the heart to come and help and take care of them. And that wealth can then be generated further out into that system. And there's no debt, there's no interest, there's no exploitation. It's a universal value. And what is in the end more important than our time?
Thanks for that, Melanie. Just so everybody knows, I work with Melanie at Water Docs Film Festival, running the social media. And I just want to say, just share a personal caveat that when I started working with Water Docs, I cared about the environment, I cared about water, but through Water Docs, whose mandate is to make people fall in love with water to the point where you don't see yourself as separate from water. Water is really you. I fell in love with water in a way that is extraordinarily difficult to describe. Like when I see the stuff now, the images of the disasters that are happening in the water, I feel it in my heart in a way that it's like it's devastating me. So I think in that way, like environmental organizations like Water Docs Film Festival and Planet in Focus that are centered around documentaries that are telling these stories and getting them out there, but framed in a way that's action-oriented. It's not depressing. It's like you can do something about that. That is also really important. So I would say that films and art are on the same level as things like the Toronto Tool Library and Sharing Depot. Like I feel a similar way when I go there and I see somebody returning a stroller that my daughter also uses on a regular basis. Like that feeling of sharing an item within a community. It's really hard to describe, but it just makes you feel like you are connected to something bigger, and that, you know, we're all one and we all deserve access to all the things we need. And I think building that infrastructure to tell all these stories, whether it's through a space where people are coming in or whether it's through the documentaries and all that stuff, it's all the same. It's all, you know, getting out of that socioeconomic system story that tells us that we're naturally competitive, that hierarchies are natural, that we're naturally greedy. None of that is true. It's just that we're locked into that story. So anything that tells the opposite story is going to help that heart piece.
Sorry if I jumped a queue. I don't know what happened. Okay. I apologize in advance because I was actually going to wait and see if there was maybe an opportunity after to maybe meet some people, but based on the conversations that have been coming up, it feels very organic. So I'm going to go ahead and take a chance here at an opportunity. Everything that's been talked about in terms of storytelling, completely agree with. And I mean, I've been a big fan of yours, Peter, for many years since the documentaries came out and Culture in Decline, waiting on Into Reflections.
Thank you.
And much like the analogy was made with The Pin in Tomorrowland, I think the same sort of thing. Like I watched your stuff and I said, finally someone is putting into words what I've been feeling for so long. Good. One of the books that is considered canon, I guess, I'm a film and television writer, actor, okay. And one of the books that's considered canon is The Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell. And Joseph Campbell says that if you want to change the world, you have to change the metaphor. So I agree with everything that you were saying about storytelling, and I agree with everything that you are doing with your documentaries. And I have written a TV pilot where I'm trying to take all the ideas that I have been inspired by your work and now put that into a sort of scripted form. And Canada's not necessarily the greatest environment to get new shows on television. Right. I'll just say that. So yeah, at the risk of being completely uncouth and a total dink, I did bring a copy, and if you, no pressure, I'm not trying to propose to you on the big kiss cam here.
I'm happy to add it to the stack of all sorts of other stuff.
I'm sure you have a plethora, yes.
In general, but no, I'm happy to look at stuff. I always take time to look at materials people give me, not only just to figure out what they're doing, but also to be inspiring. It's just another kind of input for me. So I'll just steal everything that you're doing. And
thank you. Alan Smithy, please. Yeah, no, if nothing else, even if it would be possible to like maybe shoot an email now and then, consult, hey, does this seem like I'm on the right track? And if no, hey, no hard feelings.
Well, I can do my best. I'll give you that, so I'm happy to, cool.
Appreciate it. Thank you for your work.
Yeah, thank you.
There's one back here. Molly?
My turn. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for speaking, but I'm actually going to direct this question to the two women appearing members of the panel. And Josephine, I'm really grateful that you've joined us. And I'm appreciative of your acknowledgement of the land that we stand on and of Anishinaabeg traditions. And my question is related to that. And now that we're moving towards this movement as becoming much more mainstream and institutionalized, especially in academia, than it has been previously, is there a difference between what has been talked about today and the way that many societies have lived their lives for tens of thousands of years and continue to fight for the right to live their lives that way? And I guess, what is the danger of it becoming more mainstream? And in particular, is there a role that women have to play in honoring the traditions of the past and ensuring that they always have a place in our future? Thank you.
Well, that's a big one. Yes and yes and yes. I think Of course there's dangers with anything becoming mainstream because, you know, the dominant elite will immediately try to seize upon it and toxify it, right? It's like they did that with the civil rights movement. Next thing you know, black culture has become weaponized, and the music that, you know, we created to lift us has been used to destroy us, for example. When it comes to the issue of women, you know, I was involved in various waves of feminist movements. And I think, you know, what's really, really, really important to me right now is that I want us as much as possible to break out of every old paradigm we have been dragging behind us. And that includes this gender battle. You know, like this is a big part of divide and conquer that has been so successful. Right? If you divide the genders, divide the generations, right? Then you make sure that you don't have family units, right? It means everybody has to buy their own shit. It's the perfect profit model. It's just logical according to their system. When we break that down, it becomes much more like motherhood logic. You know, like motherhood has become an insult, right? In terms of intellectual capacity. Oh, that's a motherhood statement. As in naive and stupid. Well, excuse me, I raised 5 children alone, and I resent that deeply, obviously. But my point being that all of what we're talking about, all the things that we are doing, are inherently, by their nature, going to make it better and easier for women to thrive and exist without being, you know, torn into 100 pieces. You're a working woman, you're a mother, you're a this, you're a that, you're a slut, you're a slave, you know. As we create these new systems, both women and men we'll be able to evolve past all this imposed gender role bullshit. And we'll be able to have our own meaningful self-determination, which is the ultimate expression of human rights. Not all women are the same. Not all women want to have children. Not all women want to stay home. We all need that freedom of choice, and that's the whole point. And that's why we're trying to make systems that allow for that, because how else can we possibly evolve quickly enough? If we're not able to do our best with what the gifts we are given, with what we have, we're not going to make it. But lastly, I want to say about tradition and ancestry and the like. Yes, there are many, many things that I think we're bringing forward into current day that we're remembering from the past, whether it's First Nations traditions or African traditions and the like. And I'm very blessed to work with young people who are doing a lot of really valuable work on that end, because they're recognizing that, for instance, a diverse genetic person like myself or a diverse genetic group of people needs a way to honor ancestry and honor the earth and honor each other in ceremony, which is what humans have always done, without appropriating and without going backwards. And this is something they're really working on. And they've based it and founded it on the idea and the love of water, which is in all of our bodies and is what we all are. So when we remember that and we think about that and we know that we transmute into just other forms of energy, but we're always part of the DNA and the water, right? Then it becomes very easy for us as diverse and different peoples to act like a permaculture garden and work together and help each other.
Emily, did you want to?
Sure. I hope this doesn't derail it. I'm extraordinarily tired, so getting into these like really high level concepts might be a little tricky for me right now, but I think that like what you're mentioning in terms of throwing back to kind of a time where other cultures were already living in this lifestyle story that we're talking about, kind of goes back to the bonobo chimp thing that you mentioned, where, you know, we always talk about chimps as being where we've descended from, and chimps are naturally in these hierarchies and violent and oppressing their female chimps and all this stuff. But we're also actually related to bonobos, and bonobos had developed in this completely different environment, whereas the chimps evolved in a environment where resources are scarce. The bonobos were evolving in an area where resources were abundant, and they had a completely different social structure. They were more matriarchal, they were more caring, you know, the young were cared for by the group. There wasn't this like vicious violence and aggression that was coming up. So I think in a way we're trying to go there. Like we're trying to take our species to a place where this resources are scarce, we have to be competitive. You know, if somebody gets something, it means there's not enough for me. we shift the environment to say, no, like resources are actually abundant. And if we create that culture of sharing, we're already shifting back to that mindset. And then the other thing I would say about gender is it's extraordinarily important, like what you were saying, that this divisive stuff that happens, in light of the Me Too movement and all this stuff, like it's important that all these things come out and we see them in the light and recognize that women are having a hard time in this male structure. But I find that a lot of the narrative that's missing is compassion for men. Because men have also been ingrained in this system. Why are they acting like this? Why are men putting down women like this? Why is rape a thing? Why is there this culture of objectification and violence towards women? Like, we really need to have that conversation. We can't just sit here and say, it's men that are doing this to women. Men have evolved inside this environment just as we have. They've been trained to see things in a specific way. So we really need to have that dialogue, and I'm not seeing it anywhere in the media. So that's like where we can all take that conversation. Whenever these Me Too movement conversations come up, we have to say, hey, but wait a second. Like, these people are not just bad people. They've evolved in a particular environment to understand life in a particular way, and that's why they're acting like that. So how can we change the environment so that men are not growing up in that mindset?
Mm-hmm. That's excellent, thank you. That's going to be the last question.
Thank you. Very honored to have the last question. I can't believe I got it. But in any event, first thing I want to say is, Peter, I think it's amazing that you're here and having a conversation like this. When I think about the Zeitgeist movement, I see it as a conversation. I see it as an ongoing dialogue. I think conversation and dialogue is really our only bulwark against falling to what I would call the dark arts, which I'll expand on later in this question, and I promise you there is a question at the end. But one of the biggest contributions I see that TZM brings to our political discourse, and especially you, Peter, as a spokesman for the movement, or the leader of the movement, really, is the fact that you raise the sanity waterline, okay? And I think raising the sanity waterline is an immensely important goal that we all should have as people who are concerned with our political and social well-being. So, in terms of that, what do I mean when I say the dark arts? So, from the Less Wrong wiki, what the dark arts are defined as are rhetorical techniques that are crafted to exploit human cognitive biases in order to persuade, deceive, or otherwise manipulate a person into irrationally accepting beliefs perpetuated by the practitioner of those beliefs. Mm-hmm. Now, when I've seen you engage with critics of the Zeitgeist movement or just getting involved in political discussions, I've never seen you employ these dark arts. I've always seen a strong commitment to rationality, to consequentialism, to focusing on, to borrow from your presentation, what works, right? Being able to have a coherent conversation about what it is that actually works requires a certain amount of rationality and a refusal to engage with sophistry in a general sense. And when I think about this issue and I think about what you've done to raise the sanity waterline, my mind immediately goes to two examples. The first being your video, The Intellectual Dishonesty and Pathology of Stephen Molyneux. That video is, I think, a clinic on how to identify and coherently and reasonably respond to what is blatant sophistry. And that's a challenge we all, I think, face. And then the other example is, perhaps more comically, Louis the Logic Gremlin from Culture in Decline, where you refuse to capitulate to tone shaming and restricting the content of your message and taking it away from rationalistic, consequentialist grounds and into something that sounds better or is butterier or more digestible. Right. So after saying all that, my question to you is, as someone who is committed to these ideals of rationality and coherence and having a train of thought that is defensible in those ways, what can you tell us as aspiring advocates to what can we do better and what can we look for to make our message allow it to overcome the very common dark arts that we run into that people like Stephen Molyneux engage in, or people who would even ostensive supporters of TZM who would try to shame you into changing the train of thought to something that it just sounds better or feels better.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your comments and observations and compliment. I don't know if I'm that rational or what have you. I'm just whatever I am. Obviously, we're all irrational in different ways because we're emotionally polluted. That's probably the wrong word, but that's just, yeah. So what I kind of think in my mind is there's a signal to noise ratio when you're dealing with a given individual and the ideology or concepts they're putting forward. And you can kind of get to the bottom of it pretty quickly when you talk to people that have no argument, because they instantly move into the dark arts that you talked about. It's a kind of manipulation process. And most people, unfortunately, that you speak with, they're not thinking in terms of convincing somebody of something. They're not thinking in terms of trying to see eye to eye and engage a dialectic. They're looking at it almost subconsciously from the standpoint of somebody looking next to them and figuring out who's right. And that is the pathology of Stefan Molyneux. And that's many like him that are not interested in what is truth. They're interested in being perceived as a purveyor of it. And that is unfortunately, I think, an outcome of this hyper-pluralism that's become even more politically exaggerated, where, you know, you turn on there's a bad example. Here's a kind of a hypothetical example. It's not this extreme, but and I also don't want to codify my respect for so-called academic experts, because there's plenty of flaws there too in terms of the trajectory of learning and getting a PhD. I consider it a form of indoctrination in many cases. But let's say you turn on the TV and boom, you have a highly credentialed guy or woman that studied something extensively. They've been doing it for 30 years, and they're on this show, and they have something to say. They've been working on it. And then and on the same thing, the split screen, there's Joe Bob from Montana, who happens to disagree with what this guy has to say. And this is like some kind of entertainment thing too now. And the Trump reality in the US, which has now taken people that at least were shamed enough down not to stick their head up and act like, you know, and continue the pollution process. They at least had a certain sense that maybe there's something wrong with their worldview, whether it's bigotry or whatever, or nationalist loyalty or loyalty to capitalism and so on, the symbolic blocking of their minds, because that's unfortunately the way most think. They think in terms of symbols. That's why when you talk to people about a train of thought like this, they're like, that's just Marxism. Yeah, is that communism? And that's just, they can't, because they're not either not educated enough to think long enough about it, or have the vocabulary, or they're emotionally polluted at the same time. So this, and again, back to the Trump thing, it's a unique quality. I'm not trying to, you just mentioned, let's not talk about it, but it's a unique sociological thing, because now all these people that were under the radar, we'll say they were ducking down with their ignorance, they're all alive again, and they're being taken seriously. I mean, we used to have a whole resurgence of all sorts of bogus Nazism and eugenics and general just belligerent bias of groups. So I could probably keep rambling on this. It's a very complicated question you just asked me, but so I look for these things, and usually I can kind of feel it out, but generally speaking, I don't like to debate with the traditional sense of any debate, because right now pop culture debate is not based on the original Greek concept of debate. It's not based on dialectic, meaning point to point. It's about trying to make an impression and dominate. And that's why generally if someone's like, you should debate this guy, I don't know how many people have emails like, Peter, you got to debate Jordan Peterson. Like, no. I don't want to talk to someone who's so fundamentally polluted and has such an ego and now has millions of dollars and followers. There's no way he'll ever turn around and say he's wrong. Right. There's no point. So I think the low-hanging fruit has a lot of value. I mean, obviously we have to counter. We can't just be around the choir. But when and that's why like the UBI people and just all these great groups, Bitcoin and blockchain specifically, all the people that are kind of inching into this territory, those are the ones I want to bring together. Those are the ones you want to unify. And all the people on the fringe that are throwing stones and poop, they're the ones you just continue to ignore, because they're going to be forced to change regardless. It's not an issue of like, I don't want to respect them, but I don't respect Nazis, for example. They don't deserve, if you don't respect general differences of people in the sense of them being able to live their lives their own way, in with the confines, of course, of mutual respect. Know what I mean by that? Like if you don't have an ideology that supports mutual respect, then you're not in the human club anymore, because that has to be there. Yeah, exactly. So hope that helps. And thank you for the good question.
Excellent. Okay, so I want to just thank you. Sorry, we got to cut it. I want to thank you very much to Reg, Peter. Thank you for coming and sharing your knowledge. Josephine, Emily, all the volunteers that made it happen. Everyone, thank you, CSI. Thank you, Oxygen. Thank you, Earth. Awesome. Thank you. So, of course, absolutely. If you guys wanted to give us a hand, we can stack up all these chairs. That would be hugely helpful. And actually, we got to be out here in 15 minutes and just...